Hello and welcome to Meet the Body, where we meet ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the body of Christ. And today my guest is John Woodbery. John's a lawyer and an author, and he has written a series of books. He's also a member of the Sunrise Creative Community team, and today we're going to talk about Hidden. You'll find it on the Sunrise magazine.com. And as well as on Amazon. The link will be below the interview, so you can go right there. Anyway, welcome aboard, John.
Thank you.
This book, John, I read it while I was on my cruise a couple weeks ago. Went on an Alaskan cruise, needed to read some books. Grabbed your book, brought it along, and really enjoyed it. It was a great read. And so I just want you to tell us a bit about yourself and where you came up with the idea of Hidden. We'll talk about the book a little bit without giving away too much.
I grew up in North Florida. My dad was a shade tobacco farmer. And I say shade because in about 1905, the couple farmers from North Florida were in Cuba, seeing how the Cubans grew tobacco. They were famous for that.
Right.
And they noticed that the tobacco plants in the edge of the field, where the shade of the trees affected them, had thinner leaves. And they got the inspiration to artificially create that so that they could grow thinner leaves for the use of wrapping around the outside of a cigar, which is very visible. That was about 1905. I wasn't born until 1940, but by the time I came on the scene, they grew these tobacco plants under what's called cheesecloth. And you could fly over the area and you'd see these 10-acre, 20-acre, 30-acre rectangles, white. And people would wonder, what in the world is that?
Yeah.
But there was a lot of hand labor involved, and actually the practice ended about 1975 because when the federal government imposed minimum wage for agricultural workers, it was no longer feasible to grow the crop. But anyway, that was my background.
Oh, okay.
And, I thought I was going to be doing that the rest of my life. I figured out that this thing couldn't last. And so I had gone to college, graduated from the University of Florida, where I met my lovely wife, by the way. And we were married in 1962. And I ended up, after college, going with her to Seattle and taking a job with the Boeing company and worked for a few years as a cost analyst contracts negotiator. And that would be the subcontractors that made various parts that went into Boeing airplanes.
Right.
And things got kind of rough in that industry in about 1969, 70.
That's right. And, I remember that.
There was a famous billboard sign that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?"
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, I decided it's time to make a change. So on my investigation of possibilities, I came up with the idea of going to law school. So I applied for law school, first at the University of Montana, thinking that was nearby and I would come back to Seattle. We had lived there for 4 or 5 years and were quite comfortable. And I didn't get accepted. And a friend of mine from Florida, who I had known in college in my fraternity, said, "Why don't you apply to Stetson University? They have a law school in St. Petersburg. And but if you're having trouble getting in, apply for entry in the summer school, because not as many people start in summer school and the competition is less intense." Now, I had good grades. I graduated second in my high school class, but it was very competitive. And so I did that and got accepted.
In the summer.
Yeah, and there wasn't anything wrong with my brain. I finished fifth in my class of 60.
There you go. But you didn't have as much competition getting in.
Right. And I was managing editor of the Law Review for a time. And anyway, that was kind of the background. I took the first job in Tallahassee, Florida, because it was near my home, in Havana, Florida, which is about 10 miles from the Georgia line, just north of Tallahassee.
As a lawyer.
as a lawyer,
Now, are
right?
you kind of a lawyer, or were you like
Well,
a country lawyer that stand in front of a courthouse and courtroom and trial, jury,
not quite yet. The
and
firm
tell
had
stories? Go
the
ahead.
firm had one partner was a tax attorney, estate planning, that kind of thing, and the other was a lobbyist.
Uh-huh.
But they did some civil practice as well, and that's what I did for him. And that didn't last very long. It's a long story. I don't need to go into all that. And we had lived in Tallahassee about 4 or 5 years. And it was interesting because it's during that time when I came to a closer relationship to God.
Hmm.
Because I had come after study and research, I had almost reached the conclusion that there couldn't be a God to create this. It's just too complicated to speak and have it come into existence.
Right.
And I had an older brother who was an atheist.
Yeah.
But the more I thought about it, after I thought I had reached that conclusion, the more I thought about it, that that was more complicated to explain than the fact that it was created.
Hmm.
Remember that famous statement? I think it was by Templeton. It said, "You might be able to convince me how, with evolution, one species changed into another by natural selection, but you don't get an inch closer to understanding how something came from nothing."
Yeah.
And so, anyway, we went back to church, and the rest of the story is related to that. And we
Yeah.
left Seattle, left Tallahassee in 1978, returned to Seattle in 1978, and opened a practice and been doing that ever since, and getting ready to retire now.
Okay. And of course, your story, Hidden, is about an academic in North Florida. Are your stories kind of based in that whole lifestyle, which or that region?
To a
Uh,
certain extent,
yeah.
it's easier to write about things you're most familiar with, Rick.
Right on. Yeah.
Uh, and it could have been written anywhere, but
Hmm.
I chose that because I knew the terrain better and different things that had happened and so forth in history. And
Yeah.
so that was the reason for that choice.
Okay.
And it wasn't a retelling of an actual story.
uh, yeah. It wasn't. I'm sorry. It wasn't a retelling.
It was not. One
Yeah.
about the
Okay. Because
one,
basically, Hidden is it's about an archaeologist named Montana Blake, and and reading it, it's like he is kind of a anti-hero of course, the Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Indiana Jones. You
right.
know?
In fact, that's where the idea of the name came from. His actual name in the story was Horatio Averill Blake.
Right.
Uh, I thought of a nickname. I couldn't use Indiana. That was
Yeah.
so I came up with Montana, and that led to, in the writing of the book, telling the story of him growing up in Montana, because I wanted to explain how he became what he had become, and
Right.
philosophy and decisions he made, and so forth.
Right. Now, is that the book that's on Amazon, or that you can buy, the one with the full story? Because I read the truncated version. Uh,
The short version is the one that's on Amazon.
okay. I was thinking about it. I thought, it might be a good idea to after people read this, say, hey, I want to know how this guy became who he was, and then they'd go by the prequel book, a little marketing idea. But he is a archaeologist looking for treasure, much like Indiana Jones, and he goes into the deep, dark jungles of the Amazon to
Right.
find this treasure. And he's kind of self-centered. Like I said, he's kind of an anti-hero. He's kind of self-centered, and we don't know too much about Indiana Jones, but it's almost like you like Indiana Jones from the beginning. You're not so sure you like this character of yours, and I just want to maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Your
Uh,
inspiration.
and of course, I end up writing it from the perspective of what's truth. And I thought, and from a lot of reading that I had done about how the brain works and how experiences influence the way you react to things and what you become. And I wanted to build a story for that and to kind of have an understanding. He just didn't suddenly become the domineering uh, person that he was. And he was in control of his environment, wanted to do everything for himself, was dominant. And it's almost hyperbole in a sense, but self is the problem that most of us have as we grow closer to the Lord, when he wants us to surrender to him and have all the things happen that he wants to happen to make this earth like heaven.
Right. I think that's good because you definitely bring in the religious aspect, the Christian aspect of it,
Right.
of this travel into from the self-centered man who we know that Indiana Jones would find a artifact and he wanted to give it to science.
Right.
Professor Blake here, he wants the artifact to make a name for himself, become famous, and to climb the academic tower, so to speak, be high in society and that kind of thing. And
Ends up destroying a tribe that he is supposed to be supporting.
Exactly. Yeah. So he's got a mess to make. One of the things that I thought was interesting, as he comes back, he's basically stolen this
Right.
idol, and he comes back and he decides that he writes it up and he decides to publish a book about his exploits, which are really tremendous.
Yeah.
He's a very interesting guy. He's a hard worker.
Right.
He cares for these people, but he's flawed human being, and it falls into the hands of a book publisher. I mean, a movie. Excuse me, in a movie makers, and
Right.
and basically there were two books I read on the cruise, your book, and I also read Mel Brooks's book. He's got an autobiography just came out, which I just had so much fun reading. And he talks about all these movies he's making and what it takes to make a movie and who you got to contact and who you got to sell it to and everything. And so I had just read this about Mel Brooks, and I'm reading your book, and I'm going, "Oh my gosh!" It just flowed really well. I said, "Oh, just like Mel, he's got to go find someone who will produce it and that kind of thing." And maybe talk about that a little bit, where that came. Is that something that you experienced in your practice, or because you seem to know the process really well?
Oh, you mean the movie part?
Yeah, how would you take a book and make it a movie, and then the process and the characters involved in doing that?
Well, I just did some research on that. I didn't have any experience with
Okay.
that, and it's
Well, you nailed it really well.
in fact, the pastor at the church I was going to had worked in the movie industry. He suggested a book I read, and I got one on making. Well, here I have it here.
Oh, okay.
A screenplay.
Oh, screenplay, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and the character writer is Sid Field, The Foundations of Screenwriting, and it tells you all about how to do it for 200 pages. And so
Okay.
I would have no way of knowing what you should put in a screenplay. So I adapted it for that, and that was really helpful.
Yeah.
I found that interesting, Rick, about how ideas come to you that lead to other ideas. And for example, I had named the character at his birth as Horatio Averill Blake.
Mhm.
Not thinking too much about it, I don't remember how I selected that. But when I was into the transition at the end, when he discovers that he needs to change, uh, it, that Horatio struck in my mind a memory from Shakespeare. And I quoted that line from him in one of the plays. It
Right.
says, there, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, they ever dreamt of in your philosophy. When the Spirit is speaking to the boy to tell him to tell his father, which is instrumental in changing him along with the visions that happen. But the point is that one idea leads to another, like the choosing of the nickname Montana instead of like Indiana. But that inspired me to do it. Led to the location of his birth, and so I had to create all that. But one idea leads to another,
Right, right.
and
And
another.
you know, and so Horatio Al, what's his middle name? Alger
April, A-B.
Averill, right. So, and then you took the two names and his two boys, Average and Ratio, became
Right. That's
their,
right. That's right.
their nicknames, and actually became their names, so to speak. And they're in the background, but it becomes very important. And yeah, and it's and by the end of the book, I mean, I'm in tears. I have tears. I'm really affected by what's going on, and the tragedies, and the redemption, and the redemption of little Average, who's
Yeah.
living in the shadow of Ratio. You know? And I'm thinking, how horrible, this poor kid's got this name Average. It's not fair, but you know, I want to. So I don't want to tell too much more about the book, but there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. The movie making aspect of it is interesting, and you got a couple of other books on Amazon also as well. I thought I'd give you the opportunity to say anything else you want about your book, and then maybe go ahead and tell us about the other two books that you have on there, and maybe what you're thinking about writing in the future.
Right. Okay. Well, I wrote and self-published 3 novels, including Hidden. And by the way, the title Hidden was chosen because every character in the story had something to hide.
Right.
That's where that came from. Anyway, my next one was called Two Tomb Covers. And to show you how little things can inspire ideas. In a family cemetery in North Florida, where some of my relatives were buried,
Mm-hmm.
there were 2 graves that had just brick covers with no markers to say who's there. And I couldn't find out who was buried there, asking the very people left who I knew. So that inspired the story that I called Two Tomb Covers. A little boy in the story discovers this and tries to find out the same question, and no one will answer him, but it's almost like they're hiding that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he forms a club with a group of friends to investigate this mystery. And they end up telling the whole story of that family and bring in the history of North Florida and the Civil War. It has to do with the aftermath of slavery, basically.
Okay.
That's how ideas can lead to things you write about. Writing is not difficult for me once I have an idea of what I want to say, the idea.
Yeah.
And then the next one was called Earl's Retreat. And it's a story inspired by a true character, by the way, a moonshiner from the 1930s in North Florida, in the little town of Bristol, Florida.
Sounds good.
My parents had a house on a lake in the southern part of Gadsden County, where my hometown of Havana was, named Havana for Cuba, by the way, because that came from the tobacco they learned how to make from Cuba. Anyway,
Havana wasn't a bad word.
And anyway, my father was a fox hunter, and by that, as first thought that may come to your mind is riding on horses and the English model, but it's not
Tally
that.
ho!
Right.
Fox hunter.
So anyway, this fox hunter, and he would have a pack of 6 or 8 dogs put in a back of his truck with a container over it, and they put them out, and they would jump the gray fox, which is a native to that part of Florida. And the gray fox was a small creature, but they would run, and then they'd run up a tree or go in a hole or something. The idea wasn't to catch the fox. The idea was to let the dogs run and hear what my father called the music. sound that the pack made in running.
Hmm.
And so he would they would jump. Occasionally, the dogs would jump a deer. That had a lot of deer in the area, and a deer, unlike a fox would run round and round in a local circle, and then go up a tree or somewhere. A deer would run cross county, and uh, and so they jumped a deer one time and ran into the next county, and happened to be near this place where this moonshiner lived, and
Okay.
he met him. And the guy's name was I see if I can remember it, but it doesn't matter. He's been dead 50 years. So it's no liability question.
Rest his soul.
Right. Anyway, he actually talked with him and even invited him to our house down at the lake.
Hmm.
And he had quit moonshining because a federal revenue agent was murdered in his front yard.
Oh.
And they felt sure that he had done it. See, what had happened, prohibition, the sale of alcohol was existed and then it was lifted. And when there was prohibition, there wasn't anything to enforce. But when it was lifted, then it became competitive to sell liquor through
Right.
regular businesses. And so they started enforcing the anti-liquor laws. And so
Hmm.
federal revenue agents were active in the area trying to stop these. And they all knew about this guy.
Wow.
Uh, and one of them was murdered. And they thought he had done it, but they didn't have any evidence.
Hmm.
So they never charged him. But it had changed him. It had an effect on him. He had
Hmm.
quit moonshining. He said, I'm not going to go through that.
Yeah.
And he owned a lot of land and he was a hunter and he had blind that they would call turkeys up, that kind of thing. I don't need to go into all that. And so I actually met the guy. I was probably about 10 years old at the time. And so I modeled my story, Earl's Retreat, after this guy. And in my story, he does get charged. And
Oh.
because I'm a lawyer, I can write about the jury and how a spirit intervenes with him in the story. Anyway, it's a long, complicated story.
Yeah.
And he gets reversed and he gives up his life of crime. That's the concept of retreat.
Okay.
So that was that one. So hidden, two tomb covers, Earl's Retreat. And then I had wrote another one called A Stain Among Them,
Hmm.
which had to do with in Florida, the state of Florida in about 1995 or so sued the tobacco industry to recover the cost of treatment of Medicaid patients
Oh, wow.
from cancer,
Okay.
blaming the tobacco industry for that. There was an actual lawsuit in Tallahassee
And what year is this about?
about 1995.
Oh, 95. Okay.
And,
Okay. Yeah.
and
I remember that.
anyway, the case got settled. Tobacco industry paid a lot of money and it's sort of gone from history. So I wrote a fictional account of this event and
Okay.
I called it A Stain Among Them. And that's the one I tried to get published first before Hidden. And I
Okay.
sent it to Indigo and a number of other publishers. And they liked it and wanted, but when they were talking to me and interviewing me, the process you go through with a publisher, uh, they said, why don't we start with one of your other books? Their idea was to build a reputation and then go and add others. And that's
Okay.
how Hidden came to be published by Indigo. It
Okay.
may have been a mistake to do that, looking back
Hmm.
on it. Anyway,
Yeah, it's but that's interesting. The publishing, like the movie industry, is very, very strange in that way. They,
yeah,
I read like that, so it seems like you'd want to. But anyway, so that's coming up. The book's written. That book.
yeah, it's
It's
written,
written.
it's just not published.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I did one more, got about halfway through. I was fascinated with the idea of how the brain changes and PTSD.
Mm.
And I wrote a story about that and kind of explained it. I was going to have a solution at the end, but never finished it.
Okay. Well, I'm not a fiction writer at all. I tried, but just I'm a reporter. I gotta
Yeah.
look for the facts and that kind of thing. So I'm fascinated by that. Have you always had an active imagination? Is this just something you were born with? I mean, did you?
I don't know. It's hard to say. Um, One of the points I wanted to make, I read in some of my research the concept of fiction writing and telling stories, and they have the expression show, don't tell.
Hmm.
And what they mean by that is give enough detail so that your reader can get involved personally in the story by his imagination or whatever, and they will be interested in where you're going with it. And
Right.
I tried to follow
Hmm.
that model, and rather than just tell what happened, give enough details why the characters do what they do, so you can got to get involved in it as a reader.
Right.
And how that came about in my life, the actual writing structure, I probably got from being a lawyer because writing briefs and you want to communicate
Right.
with the judge
Yeah.
uh, and tell enough so that he or she can make an informed decision and hopefully persuade. I
Right.
might tell you this short story from one of my cases without
Yeah. Go
mentioning
ahead.
names, but this fellow, it was an actual client, and he had been in the Korean War and was a machine gunner on one of the battles. And when the Chinese invaded, remember
Yeah.
that? And he said they came at night. We had flares, but you couldn't really see well enough to aim. So I had a stake on the left and the right, and I would just fire all night long, back and forth. And the next morning, the bodies would be piled up 8 or 9 feet deep.
Mm.
They'd bulldoze them away. They'd come again the next night. And you probably know enough about physiology of the brain. When you have these repeated traumatic incident, it affects the dendrites on the brain cells and changes the way you react to things. So
Mm.
when a similar sound or a similar event happens, it causes a similar reaction to you. And people will, who suffer from this PTSD, will develop techniques to uh,
Oh.
avoid
Mm.
that.
Yeah.
And what this fellow had done is he would expose himself in public to
Mm.
girls,
Oh.
not trying to rape them or anything, but it, it was a psychologically, that was my opinion, evolved technique to get his mind off the things that really bothered him, which is the leftover from the war. Anyway,
Mm.
he gets charged with a crime. I had he was a roofing contractor or something, and I had done some civil matters, contracts or whatever with him. And one week I got a phone call on about a Tuesday, and he said, I need you to represent me. I got to go to court. I said, what's up? And he said, well, I've been charged with a crime. I said, what crime? And he said, exposing myself in public. I said, when's your hearing? He said, it was on Friday that week. And I said, okay, let me check into it. So I called the prosecutors, city of Seattle, the municipal court is where it was. And I called them, and they give you what's called the discovery, which means a list of witnesses, what they're saying, and that kind of thing. And so I looked at it and had 2 eyewitnesses, looked pretty convincing. And so I said, well, I'll go ahead and I'll make a motion for continuance because I'd like to interview the witnesses and see if there's a way to cross-examine them effectively and that kind of thing. So I'll go in on Friday. I'll prepare my motion and I file it and make the pitch to the judge, and he denies it. And I said, Your Honor, it's a fundamental principle of freedom and rights in the judicial system is a defendant charged with a crime has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecutor has a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt to prove the elements of the crime. And the defendant's entitled to a fair defense, which means to investigate those facts and you're denying me that privilege. And he looked at me and he says, Mr. Woodbery, your client has two choices. He can plead guilty or we pick a jury. Which is it going to be? So I conferred with him and I said, I guess we'll pick a jury, Your Honor. Jury had nothing to lose. Probably you got to be punished anyway.
Mhm.
And they put on their case on Monday, just the next week. So I had no opportunity to prepare, and very convincing stories. And I cross-examined them the best I could, and the case lasted about an hour. And prosecutor makes his final argument. I make mine about reasonable doubt and so forth and so on. The judge says the jury will. He read the instructions that they give the jury in a criminal case, and they go outside to confer. If they're out, Rick, an hour and a half.
Mhm.
It's a bad sign.
Yeah.
Usually, if there's anybody, all you need is a hung jury. That is, it has to be unanimous. And
Right.
you get one to agree with you, then they have to try it again. In many cases, they won't.
Well, if it's long, if they're out there for a long time, that's good. That's better for the defendant.
For the defendant, right?
Yeah, gotcha.
So anyway,
Bad
they
sign.
come in, and the judge asks, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" And the foreperson said, "We have, Your Honor." The foreman will pass the verdict to the clerk. He handed it up. Clerk looked at it, handed it to the judge. Judge looked at it. Judge handed it back to the clerk. The clerk will read the verdict. And it said, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." I about fell over. How could that be? And he thanked them and excused them. And normally in a trial like that with a jury, a lawyer, even if he wins or loses, doesn't matter, wants to interview the jurors to see what was persuasive or not, so you can
Yeah.
learn from the experience.
What was he looking at? How much time was he looking at if you'd been?
I don't remember now. It's been so long. Probably a year or two, maybe. Wasn't
Okay.
all that long. But anyway,
Yeah,
so
go
I
ahead.
was going to walk over and talk to the jurors, and the judge called me to the bench. And he said, "Mr. Woodbery, your client must think you walk on water." And I couldn't help it. I said, "I don't know about that, Judge, but I guess I should thank you for denying my motion for continuance. If I'd had more time to prepare this case, he might have been found guilty."
Oh my goodness.
I left quickly.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just imagining you as a country lawyer there in Seattle. Your Honor. Anyway, I see the courtroom dramas, and of course there's Gregory Peck and Kill a Mockingbird. He's more
Yeah,
erudite. He's not that. But anyway,
yeah.
yeah. So wow, hey, it's
That's about the history of my
nice.
writing, other than I write poems for weddings. I wrote that Lift's Cup, which is in the magazine.
That's right.
I do it for birthdays and things like that, and short stories like the one I just sent you,
Yes,
and
yes.
other occasions. I did three short stories. One of the things that I do, Rick, is we have in my Rotary Club that I belong to, we have fundraisers, auctions,
Okay.
and I
Maybe for the younger folks, you tell us what a Rotary Club is.
yeah. So I offer that I will write your story,
Okay.
publish it for you, and give you 5 or 6 copies so you can hand it out to relatives.
Oh,
The other thing I do is can do wills and that kind of thing.
there you
And
go, folks.
yeah, so I did
Story, life
three,
story written. Come see John.
yeah, I had 3 short stories that I published, printed out. One was called "The Pond." It was about an incident that happened on our farm. Actually, a man drowned in the pond. He probably fell in while drunk, and after 2 or 3 days, his body floated to the surface. So I created a fictional account of that. And then one was called "The Place to Be," which I sent
Hmm,
to you, which was kind of based on a true story.
right on.
And the third one was "What We Hold Dear." It's a story of the philosophy or the way people think in that area. Anyway,
Yeah.
And two others I did for a guy who had quite a successful career, but he had a troubled background, and I named it Uncle Charles's Experiment. So I like to have a title that's sort of enticing, you know.
Yeah.
And then one other was the character's mother that he wanted me to write her story of. She had been a missionary to Africa for most of her life. She's
Hmm.
quite old. And so I named that one In and Out of Africa. Okay.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
think that's fun to do that. I enjoy it.
Yeah. That sounds great. So tell me a little bit about talk a little bit about your faith. You said earlier how you came to the Lord, pretty
Right.
much through thinking about it. Huh? Just that doesn't happen very often that someone sits there and okay, I'm going to sit down here and consider atheism versus
Right.
creator, and bam, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, but anyway, go ahead and then maybe talk about a little bit
Yeah.
about how you came to the Lord and
Right.
how you maybe quickly how you came into Sunrise, charismatic church, Pentecostal. I mean, but
My great grandfather was a Methodist pastor in
mhm,
South Carolina. And in the 1840s, he migrated to North Florida and built the first Methodist church in North Florida. The church is still there today, called something else now. And my father was brought up in a family that went to church and kind of things. But my father had an interesting story, but he didn't share much about himself. So you had to kind of pick it out of what he said, what had happened to him. But I think what happened to him was his older brother, at about age 20, was engaged to be married. His mother had already predeceased. I mean, my father's mother, my grandmother. And his older brothers died. And his father married his fiance.
hmm,
And that created a disturbance in the family.
mhm,
And my father left home, and I kind of suspected that he thought that was wrong, or maybe he was secretly in love with her or something. I don't, he would never talk about things like that. But something happened that shaped him to be what he was. That is, polite, functional, useful in the community, and concerned about everything that belonged to him or he had an interest in. Anything else, he was outside of.
mhm,
I mentioned that in one of my other writings that I sent to you.
mhm.
So that that was my background in church. We went to church every Sunday. We went to Wednesday night service. I went to boys' Sunday school class. My father went to the men's class in downtown Havana, and but didn't really think deeply about what I believed. But I was active in the church, and this was just kind of routine, you know. And
And this is in the 50s, right?
yeah, I was born in 1940, so from about 1950 to 58 when I was graduated from high school.
Right.
And I went off to college and joined a fraternity. And anyway, I had fallen in love with a girl in my class. And she and I were actually engaged to be married. And during my second year in college, I discovered that she had had an affair with somebody else,
Mm.
where she was in college in North Carolina. And that shook me up so much. And my roommates decided I needed some help, so they took me to a bar and introduced me to drinking alcohol. And
With friends like this.
right, and so then that sort of I wasn't an alcoholic or anything like that, never have been, but I believed, but didn't, you know, I wasn't really committed.
Right.
And I had an older brother who was an atheist, and we'd had talks and so forth. He was very smart. He had a PhD in English literature, taught in college, And I don't need to tell his whole story, but by the time I got in law school, that's when I went through the theological issue. Does God really exist? And as I said before, I believed for a very short time that he didn't. And then it didn't last long because it just made no sense to me
Yeah.
when I thought about it, from how all of that functioned together with the millions, billions of stars, and gravity, and the rules that function in the human body, how marvelously complex it is, how it heals itself from most infections and so forth. And so I said, if he does exist, as I believe then he did, you better go back to my roots. So I started going back to church.
Mhm.
I was married by then, and we go into church. I started getting deeper and deeper. We went away to retreats and things like that. And I had an experience one time when I was praising him over and over, and something happened to me, like a wave of emotion went through my body repeatedly and got increasingly so each time. In fact, it got so bad, and I said, God, you have to stop this. I can't take this anymore. But I think that's when I was baptized in the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
and began to speak in tongues,
Mhm.
continued to grow from there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the quick story of it all.
Yeah. All right. All righty. Well, again, the book is hidden, and there's other books. Go see John's page on Amazon, and let's get your book into the Sunrise Bookstore. That'll be our next step. It's not there right now, is it?
No. Well,
Okay.
just the name is.
Okay. Anyway,
That's
but yeah. Well, anyway, thanks for your time, John. It was great talking to you, getting to know you a little bit better. Looking forward to future works, and I'm going to check out Earl's Two Tombs and Earl's, what was that again? Earl's
Retreat.
Retreat. Yeah, yeah. Sounds like a good read. So,
I
I,
have one final comment that I got
uh,
from a girl who was a court reporter that I used quite a number of times, and she retired. And I sent her a copy of Hidden, and she wrote me in an email thanking me for doing that. And I'll just read a short segment of it.
yeah, go ahead, please do.
Said, I'm now halfway through and can't put it down. John, it's amazing. This is movie quality novel. I'm thoroughly engrossed. There are phrases throughout that absolutely grab me. I'm smiling to myself, reading along, repeatedly thinking, wow, what a great way to describe that. I should be reading it with a highlighter so I could refer back to some of them more easily when I write a remark. Happy Thanksgiving to you and your wife and family, and please send me a copy of the next book that's coming out.
Awesome.
I've kept that. It made me feel so good, that somebody
Yes.
actually appreciated what you're doing. And
Fantastic.
the
That,
one
that makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it?
it
Get a
does.
letter like that. Yeah.
And I'll probably get more back into it, Rick, now that I'm
Okay.
closing out the last of my couple of cases.
Sounds good. John's part of our creative community and been very active. He's got a poem, and if you haven't seen it yet, in sunrisemagazine.com, take a look at it. Amazon, look for John Woodbery, and I got the link down here below on this interview. So thanks a lot for
Okay.
your time, John, and God bless you. And we'll see you at church Sunday.
I'll be there.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.